Hi, my name is Robert Burns. I'm a technical leader with the Cisco Technical Services team that works primarily with ACI. Today what we're going to showcase is deploying ACI Multisite from scratch. So what we're going to kind of cover is first we'll go over an overview of the topology of the two physical fabrics I'll be working with today. We'll talk about the IPN, how everything's connected, so we have a good understanding of what we're going to be working with. Next, we'll go into the actual deployment, deploying the OVA of the MSC VM, which is our controller, and we'll go through the installation process, do the configuration, and get everything set up. Next, we'll cover the InterPod Network configuration, and this is again outside of the multi-site controller's realm. It's not going to manage that for us. That's something we have to configure for us, so we'll walk through that. For today, we'll be using a 9200 Nexus as the IPN device. Next, we'll go into a few tasks that we have to do on each of the various fabrics or sites that we want to add to the MSC to be managed. So we'll go through the steps that we have to do for that. Next, we'll go into the actual adding sites or fabrics into the MSC. We'll get them added, show you what that looks like. And as well as we'll start creating some of the policies on the multi-site controller and deploying those in a stretched manner across the various sites. Now, before we get started, there's a few requirements that you need in order to do this. Firstly is going to be you need the APIC 3.0 software and of course the switch software to go along with that. So it needs to be 3.01 or later. On the MSC side, you're going to need version 1.01 or later. You're going to need a switch for the IPN device, and this can be any device that's layer 3 that supports OSPF and jumbo frames. Those are really the only dependencies that we have. And the big requirement is going to be on the spine hardware. So the spines that you're connecting to the IPN do have to have certain hardware capabilities, and that includes having E or later fabric modules. And for the line cards themselves, they have to be EX or later line cards. So EX or F line cards are supported. If you do have spines that do not have this hardware, they can still be used in your fabric. They just can't be your InterPod connections. So only the spines that connect to the InterPod network have these dependencies. And for our leaf switches, they can be any model. It does not matter at all. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so let's take a look at our topologies here. So I've got two sites, and I'm going to call them Fab 3 and Fab 6. These are my two APIC sites. On the left side here, Fabric 3, I'll just kind of take you through it. So I do have an IPN device at the very top there. I've got a single spine switch. Now these spine switches for multi-site support, any spine switches that are connecting to your IPN do have to be EX or later. So the line cards have to be EX or FX. The fabric modules have to be FME or later. So there are some requirements there which we do have very well documented. Now, if you have spine switches that don't have the EX level of hardware, you can still use those for inter-site communication, but in terms of which you can connect to the IPN, they do have to be EX or later. Now, on my leaf switches, there's no restrictions. They can be any level, any generation of hardware. So I just have a simple pair of leaf switches. My APIC is a single APIC cluster in this case because it is a lab. Down below here, I've got a couple of UCS fabric interconnects already configured. Just set up as a VPC up to each of the leaf pairs, and I've got a VDS already configured and deployed at the bottom here with a single VM which I'm going to be using for my testing. So I've got this EPG at the bottom here which I've labeled global-EPG. That's not yet configured. That's something that we're going to do as part of this demo when we have it pushed from the multi-site controller, and I will push that EPG to all of my sites. The IPN again is a single device, so going across it is the same device I'm using because this isn't a lab, but typically we'll see customers with an IPN device within each of their sites, and they'll have some type of WAN connectivity or DCI between the various sites. So in terms of our lab, it is the same device, but I do have separate connections on each side. On the spine on the right side for Fabric 6, again, simple EX spine, 2 leaves, single APIC. And on this side, I have a bare metal host plugged in, which I'm going to use as my other endpoint. He's also going to be in that same target. So at the end of the day here, what we're hoping to accomplish is I'm going to do what's called a stretched EPG design. And this is our most basic use case for multi-site controller. I'm going to be stretching the fabric, the VRF, the BD, and the EPG across my sites. And that's going to let these two endpoints, communicate freely because they'll be in the same EPG. There will be no contract required at this point. So very simple setup in terms of the fabrics at each site. Now, if we take a look at my overall topology here, one sec, let me pull it up. Here's my the way I like to draw it out now at a little bit of a higher level, and this is going to show us how I've got my TEP addresses laid out. So there are a lot of TEPs that are used for multi-site, so I'll kind of walk through them here. So we're going to need essentially at least four TEP addresses per site. So on my left side here under Fabric 3, I've got first one is my multicast destination TEP. So if I need to send traffic to every other site, that's a multicast address we're going to be using. Below that is my unicast address. So if I have to have traffic sent to a single site, that's where my destination TEP would use the unicast address. And below that we have a multipod TEP address. And right now with the current implementation at 3.0, we're only going to be supporting a single pod. We're not going to be supporting multipod plus multi-site in this version. We do have to provide this multipod address, but essentially once we get or traffic directed to a site, it'll have to be further directed to a specific pod, and that's where that MPod destination TEP will come into play. But like I said, for now, because we're only supporting one pod, we have to have an address within the same range, and it will have to be routable over the IPN, as will all of our TEP addresses. The last and the lowest kind of common denominator here is our control plane TEP, and this will be assigned for each spine in a site that's connected to the IPN. So I only have a single spine plugged into my IPN, therefore I only need a single control plane TEP assigned. So I've mirrored my config on both sides. I've just changed the middle lock text to signify the site. So this is site 3, and this is going to be site 6. So kept it very simple. It really helps with troubleshooting if you're consistent with your IP addressing system. Now in the middle here, I'm going to use, again, it's a single device, but I'm going to have an OSPF connection between each one. It's going to be a point-to-point link. So I've just got, again, the addresses for my point-to-point interfaces are just going to signify the sites that they're connected to, and it keeps everything nice and clear in my head. Now, one very important note on the area, I'm using area 1 as a regular area. If you want to use area 0, that's fine. It'll be a regular area. If you do want to use some of the other stub or not so stubby areas, just double check any known caveats. There were some issues in earlier code where using anything other than area 0 as a stub or not so stubby area, there were some issues with. If you do stay with a regular area, no matter the area ID, you're going to be fine 100%. My multi-site controllers are deployed on an external ESX box. It really just has connectivity to the APIX, so my APIC out of band, that network kind of meshes into my multi-site controller. So there's reachability between my multi-site controller and my various APICs in each site. We're going to be configuring this as part of this demo. We'll deploy the 3 VMs and we'll configure them as they were from scratch. And I've got my 3 node IDs I'm going to need here for my IP addresses for management. That's it for the topology. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, the next step in our process is we're going to deploy the multi-site controller nodes. So I've gone ahead here and just used the OVA image to deploy these 3 VMs. Now you can either use the OVA image to deploy 3 separate instances, or you can deploy one from the OVA and just clone it twice. I've decided to use my naming convention like this. The VM naming does not matter, but the host name of the OS will matter. So I've gone ahead and used these for mine. I'm going to go ahead and power these guys up, and we'll go ahead and get them configured. So yeah, just name them as you want, node 1, 2, and 3. But I'm using MSC just to keep it very simple. Now you can move these 3 nodes across multiple hosts if you do want to have a little bit of redundancy, obviously. In an HA or DRS cluster, that's probably best practice. You could certainly do so. What we don't want is there is a standalone way you can deploy multi-site, but that would really just be used for a lab environment. For any type of production setup, we would highly recommend that you deploy these in a 3-node Docker Swarm cluster. So I'll go ahead and open up my first console here to my node 1, and we'll go ahead and get him configured. Okay, so it comes up, so we're going to go ahead and log in with our default credentials, which is just going to be root and Cisco. And I'll try it again. And the first thing it's going to ask is to change the root password. So we have to re-enter the existing password, and you might get caught up on that, but re-enter Cisco again. And now I will go ahead and assign my permanent root password. Okay, it will have to be a complex password as well. So now that I'm logged in here, I'm going to go ahead and set up some of the basic networking. So there's a little utility you can run called MNT UI, and this will allow you to configure the networking IP. You can also do this through other utilities using ifconfig or modifying the network scripts, but the utility makes it kind of really simple to do so. So I'm just going to readjust this guy. Okay, so we're going to edit a connection ETH0, and I'm going to go ahead and add, I'm going to change the IPv4 to manual, and then if I expand, I can go ahead and enter the address here. So I'm going to give him his address, and he'll be .204, and we put in the subnet mask like this. I'm going to give him a gateway because I obviously do want him to be routable. And that's all I really need. If you want to add in DNS and a search domain, you can do so, but for my lab purposes here, I'm not going to bother doing that. Get that a little bigger so we can see the whole console. Okay, once you're all done, you can go ahead down, just toggle all the way down to OK. And go ahead and back out. And now we will have to deactivate and reactivate this connection. So right now it's active. I'm just going to toggle it. Now it's deactivated and reactivated. That essentially does an ifconfig up-down just to make the new IP settings active. Now the other thing we have to do too is we have to set the node name. Now we start prefacing the name here MSC. We have a mandatory requirement that it has to be called specifically node 1, node 2, and node 3. So make sure you name these, very important. If you don't, Mongo will not start and your database will not work. So a lot of the services are dependent on these names. We're hoping in a future release that we do have some more leeway in terms of that naming convention, but for right now, they do have to be named Node 1, Node 2, Node 3. Okay, all good. Once I'm done, I can go ahead and back out here. And just as a test, I'll probably just try and ping my gateway, make sure I got connectivity. Looks good. Okay, so I can go ahead and exit out of there. I'll reconnect afterwards with SSH. So this particular console is done. So now I'll close him and I'll go ahead and move on to number 2. Okay, let's go ahead and log in again. Root and Cisco. So these guys are not clustered in terms of their user accounts, so you do have to set these up individually. So I'm just going to use the same password assigned. Reconfirm it. Okay, let's go ahead and run our utility. We're going to edit ETH0. So I'm going to go a little faster here just because this is, I kind of talked through it on the first one, and it's really the same process, so it gets a little tedious here. And we'll give it our gateway. Okay, and we'll back out. And we'll deactivate and reactivate. And we'll set the host name. This guy will be node 2. Okay, and of course we'll just do a ping test. Let's make sure he can reach the other manager. Yes, he can, so that's good. Okay, we're done here. And one more. Root, default Cisco, change it to my permanent password. Let's run our utility. And we'll do static. 172.16.176. This guy will be 206. Okay. All right, so there's our three guys. Just gonna reset his connection and set his host name. This guy will be node 3. Okay, that looks good. All right, let's make sure we got connectivity. Excellent. Okay, we'll go ahead and exit out of there. And I'm going to reconnect back now with SSH. It'll be much quicker and easier because you're going to have to do copy and pasting. So from here on in, we highly recommend you connect to them via SSH. So we'll still log in with root with my new root password. Okay, so there's node 1. I'll go ahead and get all three open here just to make it easier to move around. There's 2 and then one more. Okay, so I've got my 3 here, so I'm going to start off on the first guy where I'm going to run the initialization to configure Docker. So I'll go back over here to node 1, but you could really do this on any one of them. We have to move to our folder where our scripts are contained. They're not added to the path, so we do have to migrate there. Builds, and this will be our build number, which we only have one build. So that's my current build. This might change if you're using a slightly newer build. And prod HA, which has the HA scripts that we're going to need. So we'll go into here. So in here I've got a few scripts that come bundled with MSC, and the one I have to run initially is going to be this config one. So I'm just going to run him, MSC CFG, and this is the init one. So we'll go ahead and run him. So it's going to start creating the Docker swarm. So we're going to have 3 members. One will be a leader, the other 2 will be followers. And we'll give this a second here. So I'll just pause it while this is doing its thing. It takes about 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, so it's completed, and what we expect to see is that the swarm was created, the Docker secrets are there. Here's kind of my handle, my token I'm going to use on my other nodes. So to join the other nodes, it tells me here's the kind of the command I'm going to need on to join them. So I'll go ahead and I'm going to use that on my other nodes here. So now I'm going to go over to my second node, and actually I'm going to copy this token. So if I grab this whole thing here, and I'm going to have to specify the IP of the first node here. So I'm just going to copy that one there. I'm going to go over to my second node here, and I'm going to navigate to the same place. So opt Cisco MSC builds prod HA. Let me get the right build path. Now in here, there's going to be a join script I'm going to run here. So I'm going to run this join script. I can actually just paste it because it did give me the command from the first manager. So if I just paste that, oh, it didn't copy it. Let me try that again. So I'm just going to go all the way, take the token and everything we need, copy that, paste it in here, and I have to give the address of my first manager. So he was 204. Okay, so we go ahead and do that. And it shouldn't take very long, but he should go ahead and join the cluster. Okay, doesn't take more than really like 30 seconds. He said that he's now joined as a swarm manager. So what I could do if I want, I can go back to my first node here. I'm just going to stretch it out for some of the outputs. I can go docker node list ls, and it shows me I've got 2 of my nodes here. So I'm logged into the first node, and the other guy is reachable. So that's what we want to see. My first guy is obviously my leader. My second guy is active and reachable. Great. So we'll go ahead and do our last one now. I'm going to do the same thing on node 3. And we'll just copy the exact thing we used from here. So same command. make sure we're on node 3 and give them a second to join. So the only really problems you might have, like I said, if you don't name the nodes specifically node 1, node 2, node 3, you might see there's a problem or an error fault. Look on the manager when it's if it has a problem starting some of the services that we're about to deploy, you'll see some very obvious warnings. Okay, so we've joined. So even on this node here, I can do the same thing. Okay, so it shows me my 3 guys are there, they're all active, and they are all reachable. Just replay that to make it nice and neat. Okay, so I'm logged into node 3, but these commands, because it is a swarm, we can run them on any of the nodes. Okay, so my node has been deployed. My Docker swarm is now ready for us to deploy the MSC stack. Now I can do the next part from any node I want. I'm just going to happen to use it, do it from my node 1 here, but I can deploy the MSC stack from anywhere. So looking back into that directory here, I've got this MSC deploy script, and that's what we're going to deploy next here. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this script. So you want to give it some time here and make sure we very clearly can see everything coming up here. So we're waiting for Mongo database services to be ready, which is great. And again, keep an eye on these messages. If you see something with Mongo not able to find a node or reach, that could be a naming problem with one of the other nodes here. Okay, so everything looks good so far. It's creating all the Mongo databases, configuring our cluster, and good. Okay, so it looks like the cluster stack has deployed. Now the next thing we want to do is make sure that all the microservices are running. So if I do a Docker service list, I'm going to see I've got all my various services listed here and how many replicas there are. So some of these are going to be replicated across all 3 nodes, and some are just going to be local. And you'll see they'll starting up here. So my MongoDB3 here he's ready to go. MongoDB1 is online. I'm still waiting for the platform service and my UI. So if I just kind of replay this command here, they should start coming up here. So I can see now my site service is replicated to 2 of the 3 sites. And we'll just give this guy a few minutes. It could take about 5 minutes, but I really like to stay here until all my services are replicated 3 ways. Now again, if you see something like the MongoDB1 not starting for some reason, that's typically a resultant of the node name mismatch. It can't detect it because it is hard-coded. So give it a couple more minutes here. Okay, so everything started. I'm just waiting on one more Kong service to replicate, so we'll give them a couple more seconds here. Okay, let's check them again here. Still waiting for that last Kong database to come up here. So they can take up to about 5 minutes here, so we'll just be patient. I'll just put the recording on pause until this comes up, just in the respective time. Okay, took about 3 or 4 minutes here, but I can see now that my Kong service has started. So at this point, we're good to go. We can go ahead and log into our UI. So I'm going to go ahead and close these SSH sessions. I'm not going to need these anymore. And we can go ahead and launch our UI. Now for the UI, just like the APIC, I can go to any one of them. So we start off going HTTPS and the IP or host name of the respective node. So I'm just going to go to my leader, the first guy, node 1. And we'll let them load up here. So Firefox is just caching my credentials, but essentially the name and username, this is kind of our front end NGINX user ID. So it's going to be admin, and the default is going to be WE1COME bang. So it's going to ask me to retype it. It's going to make me change my admin password. So this is separate from our our root account. So WE1COME bang, and then now I can assign my new password, and it tells me as I'm going through it if it meets my criteria for a strong password. Okay, so password reset. I'm logged into my GUI here for the MSC. My controller status shows me 3 of 3 are online and available, which is great. Now there's a bunch of other things that we're going to have to do here, but before we move on to configuring any sites or tenants or any of this, I'm going to go ahead and shift gears and now do my IPN connectivity to make sure that's up and running here. So we'll stop here and I'll continue on with the IPN connection. Okay, so now that Multisite Controller has been deployed and my status is showing that all 3 of the nodes are online and functional, we're going to go ahead and configure the IPN itself. So I will bring up my IPN here, and this is just a Nexus 9232 device that I'm using here. The only thing I really have configured in terms of kind of pre-configuration is I've only set up the policy map setup for jumbo frame. So I've increased the system MTU to be 9216, but nothing else is really done. One of the nice things about multi-site is there's no dependency on the multicast within the IPN. So I don't need to have pin biter support, etc., which is a requirement for multi-pod. So very simple requirements in terms of which devices you can use for your IPN. Now let's go back to my topology really quickly here. So I'm going to have Fabric 3 on the left here and Fabric 6 on the right. Now both of these do connect to the same physical device. I'm just simulating my IPN through a single 9232 device. But typically you'd see customers having either one or more IPN devices on either side or at each site with a WAN or DCI connection between them. As long as I can route between the fabrics, that's really what I'm looking for here. Now with multi-site, we're going to need quite a few DTEP or destination TEP addresses, and these have to be routable through the IPN network. So I've laid mine out of how I'm going to assign them, and this is part of what I'm going to do in the coming steps. So I've got a multicast TEP, I've got a unicast TEP, a multipod, which is kind of like a dummy TEP for our purposes, but it still has to be assigned, and then a control plane TEP, which is assigned to every spine, and that's what we use to make our BGP relationships and tunnels between the various site spines. So let's go ahead and get started here. Now I'm going to bring up my topology for the site 3. So this is the connection right here I'm going to be configuring. So I'm using port 1/9, and the interface address I'm going to use is 3332, and on the other side, on my spine connection, I'll use 3331/30. The only configuration I have to do is really the IPN side manually. The southern side, or the side that goes to my spine on the fabric, is going to be pushed from MSC, so that's something that we'll configure later on as well. So I'm going to set up both connections for Fabric 3 and for Fabric 6, at least in terms of the IPN connection. So I'm logged in here, and the first thing I'm going to do is I want to create a new VRF. So I'm going to create VRF called Multisite, just to keep my multi-site routing instance a little bit separated. Next thing we'll do is configure the OSPF process. So I'm going to go ahead and start that up, OSPF, and I'm going to call it multi-site or MSite. I'm going to assign this to my VRF, and lastly I'm going to go ahead and assign the router ID just to be 333.2, which just happens to be the first interface I'm going to configure, but you're free to kind of use whatever router ID suits your needs. Okay, so that's done. Now I'll start configuring this first port here. Now one thing with multipod and multi-site is they have a dependency to use VLAN 4, so I will use a sub interface to do that, and I'll set the encapsulation to be VLAN 4. That's hard coded in the system. That's nothing we can configure at this time, so it's something we'll just have to consider as we're setting this up here. So first thing I'll do is I'll go into back into config mode, and we'll go into the first interface. And the first thing I'm going to do on this interface is I'm going to increase the MTU. Now, let's try that again, and I'll crank up the MTU to 9,000 because that's what's going to match my OSPF configuration on the ACI side. And the other thing I'll do is put it into the correct VRF and make sure we don't shut it. Now to create the sub interface, we'll just go ETH1/9, and I'll use sub interface 4. And I'm going to use the encapsulation of VLAN 4. So I like to match up the VLAN encapsulation with the sub interface number, and that helps me keep it nice and squared away. Same thing, we'll set the MTU as well. I do recommend adding a description as well, so you know exactly what your connections go to. And if you're ever unsure, you can always use CDP or LLDP to determine which interfaces you are connected to if you're not sure. So we're going to add this guy as well to the correct VRF. And then now I can start configuring the IP addresses. So make sure you configure your VRF first if you're going to do that and assign it to the sub interface, because as soon as you start adding addresses and then you assign it to a VRF, you're going to wipe out all the configuration as it kind of details here. So make sure you do the VRF first and then you do worry about the addresses. Okay, so let's start setting up the addresses. So I'm going to go IP address 333.2/30. We're going to go ahead and set the OSPF network type to being a point-to-point. Next, I'll assign the OSPF and the area type. So IP router, OSPF, process ID, which is MSite, and I'm just going to put this in area 0, and I'm going to keep it as a regular area type. You could use not so stubby if you wish. There are some additional considerations with that, but for purposes of here, we're going to keep it very simple. And we're going to no shut it. Okay, so that's for going down to my first site. So this guy here has been configured. If I change my topology to look at 6, let's do this guy. So he's using port 110, so I'll pretty much replicate most of the same configuration. So I'll go into 1/10. I'll go ahead and set the VRF first, so we'll go MTU 9000 quickly. VRF member multi-site. And make sure we unshut it. And then we'll do the sub interface now. And we'll do the same thing we essentially did. So we'll do our encap.1q4 MTU 9000 VRF member MSite. Now we can start assigning the IP. So this guy's going to be 6.6.6.2/30, just confirming with my diagram. We will do the OSPF network type and the OSPF router, OSPF MSite, and we'll use area 0 as well, and of course do a no shut. Okay, so that's configured. So my IPN is essentially done in terms of what I've got to do for it. The rest I'll do on the fabric and on the multi-site controller. So next thing is we'll move over to the Apex and do some work on there. Okay, so with that done, we've got the IPN configuration complete. The next part we're going to do is configure some of the APIC or fabric specific configurations. So the MSC will push some of this configuration, so it'll push the logical node profile information for the OSPF, but there is still some of the access policies that we do have to manually configure on each of the respective fabrics. So we're going to go ahead and jump into our first APIC, and I'll go ahead and get logged in here. So the first thing I'm going to do is set up those fabric policies. So this is something, again, we have to set up just like we would if we're connecting to bare metal host. There's domains, AEPs, policy groups, and interface selectors that we would have to set up. We have to do the same thing as well with the multi-site configuration. So the first thing I'm going to need is my VLAN pool. So I'm going to be using VLAN 4 for the OSPF sub-interface. So we have to allow that VLAN. And I'll just call this VLAN pool MSite. Very simple, with a static allocation of just a single VLAN. And I'm going to grade it VLAN 4. So pretty straightforward. Okay, next thing I'm going to do, coming down, I'm going to create the AEP. And you can do these in whatever order you wish. I'm just going to kind of go this way. So I'll create the AEP next. And I'll just call it very simply MSite-AEP. And we will go next. And I'm not going to assign it to any interfaces. Next, I will create my domain. So I have to create an external routed domain. It'll be a layer 3 domain. And we'll just call this MSite L3. The AEP I previously created, which was called MSite, you select the VLAN pool, and that's all we need for the domain config. And that's something that we're going to have to select from the multi-site controller when we get to that point. So I've got the basic kind of global policies configured, the pools and the VLANs. The next thing I have to do is take care of the interfaces. So I'm going to come into the interface policies and into policy groups. And just like I would if I was using a bare metal host or something connected to a leaf, I would use a leaf policy. This time I'm going to create a spine policy group because we are talking about a spine policy interface. And I'll call this guy here spine 1 pol group. Link level policy just determines the speed. So I've got policies I've already created. One was my 10G auto for my southern interfaces on the leaves, and I've also got a policy called 40 gig auto, which is my IPN speed. So the interface between my spine and my IPN is a 40 gig link. So I'm just going to hard code that. I'm also going to turn on CDP just because I want it turned on, and I will assign it to the AEP we previously created. So I've got my policy group. Next thing I'll have to do is create a spine profile. So if I expand profiles here, and we will create a spine interface profile, and we'll call this one spine 1 IPN. And the interface for this particular spine, and if I ever want to double check my work, I always go back to my diagram, and I'm going to be using port 532. This is a modular chassis, so we got to know exactly which one we're going to use here. So for the name of the selector, I usually keep them pretty consistent with the parent names, and 532 will be the interface, and of course my policy group for the spine has been assigned. And we submit. And last but not least, we have to create a spine switch select policy. So we've done this before many times. We're doing leaf selectors. Same thing applies with our spines. So I'm going to create a new spine profile here, and I'm going to call it simply spine 1. And you can use the spine number you want, or if you want to use the node number, you can. It completely depends on whatever you like. The really important part is the block, and this has to be the node number. So my node for spine 1 is 201, and then we update that. And it'll even give me the opportunity here to select the interface profiles for those spines. So I'm going to go ahead and assign that spine IPN profile that we created over here just a minute ago. Okay, so we're all done there. Pretty much done. That's all I'm going to have to do for this particular fabric. Now I'll have to do the same thing on the other side as well. So let's go ahead and do that. So if I go over to fabric and my access policies, and let's go in here. So some of these I've already pre-configured just in respectful of time, but I'm just going to kind of showcase that I do have these already created, but it's the exact same process of as what I would have done on the other fabric. So I've got the AEP there. I've got my multi-site VLAN pool with just VLAN ID of 4, and I've got my domain using the same name. These could be different domains, it doesn't matter, but I just kept mine consistent. And then I've got my interface profiles also done. So I'll just go show you the policy group. There's the policy group, and I have my spine profile called spine IPN1, which will reference this policy group. Okay, and then lastly is the switch policy, where I do have that defined. So there's my switch profile for the spines, which is 201. I happen to call it 201 in this fabric, but again, the important part is that node ID under the block, and that assigns the links it together. Okay, so that's all good. So the last thing I have to do now before I jump into the hardcore multi-site controller configuration is there's one last important policy we're going to have to configure. And this should be done kind of at this point before we get into the multi-site controller part. So you're going to want to go to the infra tenant. We expand the networking and protocol policies, and we have to configure what's called our fabric external connection policy. So if this doesn't exist, you can easily create it. So I'll blow this away here and recreate it for us just to show you the process. So you just come down here, go create intrasite policy. The only thing I really need to add here is the pod and our multi-pod TEP. So the pod number for the first one is always going to be 1. We're going to keep that. And the data plane tep we're going to use, and I'm going to drive back over to my details. And let me get that guy back up here. Just ran away from me. Is the first one I'm going to use is this multi-pod tep. So it's kind of a dummy tep because we really don't support more than one pod with Multisite at this point for the 3.0 release. So, but I do have to have an IP. Now you could copy, some of your other teps, but I like to keep it separate, even though it doesn't matter. At some point, we will support multiple pods, so I like to keep a separate IP for it. So the one that's asking for me here, this data plane tep, is the multi-pod tep IP. So this will be 3.3.13, and we click OK and submit. So that fabric connection policy now has the multi-pod tep. This intersite data plane tep is essentially going to be our unicast tep. So this .11 IP will get pushed once we attach it as a site to Multisite Controller. So I'm just going to do the same thing for the other side. I'm going to do this for site 6. Go into my tenants, into infra, and then drill into networking and protocol policies and fabric external connection policy. And we're going to create one and add, keep one, and this guy, if I move my diagram over, is going to be essentially the same thing, just going to be with 6s. So 172.6.6.13, and we update and submit that. Okay, so that's done. Now we can move on to the Multisite Controller and start adding in some of our sites. Now, a quick note on the sites is be very careful when you're adding sites, because there's something called the site ID that we have to assign that remains persistent for the life of the fabric. So once that's been assigned, you cannot change it. Now, in my case here, I did have my fabrics connected to this controller at one point, and I've just unlinked them. But the site ID I originally assigned still is applicable. So it's going to read that in when I add my sites. In your case, if you're doing a greenfield and you're adding sites for the first time, it will prompt you to add the site ID or define it, and it has to be unique per site. So first thing I'll do here is I'll go to my sites and I'm going to add my first site. So this guy, I'm going to use this one. This is my first fabric called SJ Fab 3. My controller, my APIC URL, and just going to put in the IP or host name of your APIC. And if you did have multiple controllers, you can add, number 2, number 3, 4, and 5 if you have them. In my case, I only have a single controller on each fabric. We're going to want to give it the credentials and make sure those are correct. And that's pretty much it. So even still, I don't see any fields for the site ID, and neither will you until you click the Save button. Now, because again, my sites have been previously added, I'm not going to see that pop up. What I will do is I'll overlay here a screenshot of what that warning message looks like for the site ID. So I'm going to go ahead and click Save. So it's gone ahead, connected to that fabric, and we've read in the overall fabric score as being 93, so we've got a good connection to it. Next thing I'll do is my next site. So I'll do number 2. Okay, so this guy is going to be called SJ Fab 6. I'll give it the URL 192.168.80, username, password, and again, this guy was part of it, so it's not going to prompt me for the site ID, but it was previously set as 6. So my 2 site IDs respectively were site ID was assigned was 3 to Fab 3 and 6 for Fabric 6. So that's been done. Now the next part is to configure the infrastructure. And this is kind of a one-time, as you're adding sites, you only have to do this really one time. And if you want to expand sites, you may have to come back here. So a lot of our control plane settings are going to remain default. We're not going to mess around with the peering type or any of the initial timers. Leave those as is unless you have a good reason to change those. There's also an OSPF policy which is by default. So we set up things like the priority, cost of the interfaces, etc. So again, this is all default values. I'm going to leave those, but just make sure that you match up with your IPN configuration if you've changed anything from defaults. So the next thing I'll do is I'll come down under sites. I'm going to click on my first site. So this is the entire site showing me Fabric 3. And right now you can see my BGP peering is off because I haven't really done that yet. And this guy is not enabled for multi-site. So in order to do so, we've got to turn on enable for multi-site. It's read in that site ID that already was assigned, and if you assigned anyone, this would show up. Now I have to start assigning my multicast and my other destination TEP addresses. So let's go ahead and squeeze over here. So looking at site 3, my multicast TEP address I'm going to be using is going to be .10. So we'll go 172.3.3.10. My BGP AS is read in from your system policy, so that's already been read in. You don't have to change that. That's pulled in from the respective fabric. The community is required, so if you've got a community name you want to use, or you can use some of the default ones, I'm just going to use the unknown. As long as it follows the correct format, it'll be fine. The OSPF area ID I'm going to use will be 0, and I want it to be a regular type. So you can also choose from not so stubby or stub area, depending on if you want certain prefixes leaked into the IPN or not. And lastly, we need to set the routing domain. So here's the name of the routing domain for Fabric 3 that we previously created, and I'm going to go ahead and select that. Now I'm not going to click on submit. The next thing after I've got all these fields filled out is I have to configure now the a little bit lower level configuration. So now I need the unicast TEP address. So again, this could copy with your pod IP, but for my purposes, I'm going to keep them separate. So for my unicast IP, I'm using .11. So this will be 172.3.3.11. And then coming down, I need to set my control plane TEPs here as well. In this configuration, I'm going to delete this and redo this because that was from a previous config. So the first thing I would have to do is for each spine, I need a CP TEP or a control plane TEP. I only have a single spine connecting to my IPN, so I only need a single CP TEP address. So this one's going to be .12. So I would come to here, click on the spine that I'm going to start with, which is spine 1, and the first thing I have to do is add the port. Now for my topology, this will be port 532. The address, and this is going to be your OSPF link, so let me actually bring in my topology here. And this address here is going to be my other side of the OSPF. So this will be 3.3.3.1/30. And get my fingers right here, 1.30. The MTU I'm going to set as 9000 because that's what the IPN has been configured for, and I'm going to keep the default OSPF policy and save. So now that I've configured that, I've got the port, I've got the MTU. If you have multiple ports, you can continue to add them. I only have a single port, but you can add as many ports as you have. I'm going to turn on the BGP peering because I want this specific spine to peer with the other spines in the other fabric, so I've got a VXLAN tunnel in between. So now here's where I need a control plane TEP address for each peered BGP member. So my control plane TEP for this guy for spine 1 is going to be .12. So 172.3.3.12. And I'm going to enable him as a spine route reflector. Okay, so that's pretty much it for that guy. I'm going to go ahead and click on apply. And we're giving a very glaring warning saying that I've got some overlap with some of my TEPs. So we do validation as well. So saying, hey, your multicast TEP and unicast TEP are overlapping here, which is not good. So let's just double check. So I've used .10 for my multicast TEP. Let's make sure that matches with what our IPN, what our details should be configured for. And I'm going to take a look at my diagram and squeeze him over. So .10 should be the multicast, unicast should be .11, so let's go ahead and make sure that's correct. So there's my unicast TEP, which should be .11. So just fat fingered that, so .10. So if I go back, my site is .10, my unicast TEP is 11, my control plane is 12, and then what I configured on the multisite on the back over here on fabric 3 was 13. So I've got 10, 11, 12, 13, which have been assigned. Let's go ahead and apply that. So it's going to validate it. It says, yep, everything's good now. And if I go back over to that fabric now, I can see that it's pushed this .11 address to the fabric. So I know I've got good connection, and we've assigned that unicast TEP to the external connection policy. So that guy's done. Let's go ahead and do fabric 6. So same thing here. I'm going to enable him for multi-site. He's going to read in that. His multicast app will be 172.6.6.10. The AS in this particular fabric was using 600. No problem. I'll use the same community for BGP. And my area ID, I'll use 0. Make sure I change this to a regular area. And my routing domain is called msite on this fabric. And that's good. Coming down, we'll do the next one, which is the data plane unicast TEP. So 172.6.6.11. And it can always make sure unicast TEP for this guy here is going to be indeed .11. And next thing I'll do, pretty much all I need for that is my control plane TEP. So I need to add the port first. And for this guy, we're going to be using port, and I need my other topology, which has my interface numbers on it, is going to be port 1/31. So this will be 131. His IP address will be 6.6.6.1/30. My MT will be 9000. And I'm going to keep the default policy. Okay, now we got to turn on the BGP peering. I only have a single interface, so if you did have more, again, you could always add additional ones. My control plane TEP on this side for this spine will be .12. So 172.6.6.12. And route reflector is turned on. Okay, and we'll go ahead and apply that. Okay, configuration is successful. So now that my config's good, we can go back to one of our fabrics and check to see if everything's been configured correctly. So what I might want to do is come over to my routed networks. Here I can see this intersite L3 out has been configured. And if I expand it down here, I can look and see the node profile. There's for node 201. And all of this configuration has been pushed from the multi-site controller. So it's created this node profile, interface profile, and on the OSPF for that particular interface that I defined. So here's all the information. Again, anything if I were to change locally on the fabrics will remain in effect, but as soon as I go back to my multi-site controller and reapply the config, it's going to overwrite it. So we recommend that once a policy is owned by the multi-site controller, you let it remain so and make all your changes on the multi-site controller, because there's a good chance as soon as you reapply it or someone else reapplies it, you could lose it. So now at this point, I've got the OSPF configuration good. I'm going to go ahead and log back in to my IPN where I left off, and let's go show IP OSPF. Let's look at neighbors to make sure they came up, and look at the VRF msite. Okay, great. So I've got a full neighborhood established between both of my routers. So I've got the IPN port to spine 1 and fab 3 and my IPN connection to fabric 6, which are both up. So my IPN is configured and as well as both of my fabrics. So at this point, my IPN configuration is done. Now from here, what I would start doing is we'll start creating some of our schemas and our templates to push some of our policies. Okay, so now that our IPN is all set up, we can start deploying some of our MSC policies. So we're going to take a look at the deployment we're going to be doing today. So with MSC, I'm going to be doing a very simple use case here, which is stretching the tenant, the VRF, and the bridge domain and EPG across both sites. And this is kind of logically what it looks like it's going to happen. So single VRF, single BD, single subnet, and single EPG, which we'll configure on MSC. There will be some site-specific things we'll have to do. For example, if you remember from my topology, I have a VM on Fabric 3 going through UCS, and my other test host is going to be a Nexus 3K interface on Fabric 6. So we're going to have to define the endpoints differently than we will for some of these global policies, but we'll walk ourselves through that part. So back, I'm logged into MSC here. we're going to go ahead and configure, first of all, our tenant. So we'll log in here, and we're going to go add tenant. And the first thing I'll do is give it a display name. So I'll give it a name. I'll just call it Global TN. I can give it a description if I want. Now the object name that I use here is what's going to be the object name in ACI. Now once this is set, we can't change the object name. However, in MSC, we can always rename this display name to a more friendly name if we need to. So if you had a naming convention you want to keep consistent, you can do so, but you can always come in here and change it if you need to. And I do want to have this tenant associated to both of my sites. So if I look at my Fabric 3 here, I can see that right now I do not have any tenant called global-tn. So that's going to be pushed from APEC or from the MSC to the APEC. So I'm going to go ahead and associate with all sites in the default security domains, and we're going to save that. So we have to have the tenant configuration pushed first in order to push policies. So now if I look, I've got a tenant now called global-tn, which was pushed from the MSC. And if I look inside here, there's not going to be really too much to it. It's really just the shell of a tenant. There hasn't been any bridge domains or application profiles yet, so it's going to be pretty bare for the most part. So it just leaves it expanded. So the next part I'm going to do here is the important part of the meat and potatoes of setting up MSC policies, and that's under schemas. So I'm going to go in here and create my first schema. So you can kind of think of your schema as almost being kind of an application deployment, if you will. So my use case here, which is going to be the layer 2 stretched EPG, BD, VRF, that's going to be really kind of my schema. So I'm going to give it a name up here, and we're going to call it stretched EPG, BD, VRF, and you can call this whatever you like, but this is going to be kind of my use case I'm going to be doing here. And under the templates is where I'm going to define the criteria that will get pushed to both sites. So I'm going to use a single schema and a single template to accomplish what I want. And that template, because all the policies are essentially going to be the same, I'm going to link that to the various sites. So let's start off here. I'll go template. I'm just going to rename this guy here, and we're going to call this one, we'll call it just very simple temp stretch policy, and you can name this whatever you like. Now first thing I'm going to do here is I have to select a tenant. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to use the tenant I previously created. So I could use the default common, but I want to use a specific tenant. So once I select the tenant, it gives me all the same building blocks that you'd find on the APEC. So the first thing we're going to do is create an application profile. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to give it a name here. We're going to just call this one app1, very simple. And I'm going to add my EPG here. And if you remember from our topology here, I'm going to call this my web EPG, and it's going to be stretched across. So we're going to give it a name here for the EPG. Let's just call it web EPG. I'm not going to send a gateway to the EPG level. The next thing I'll have to do is define a bridge domain. So I haven't configured a bridge domain, so I can just start typing, and it's at the bottom here. I can actually create it on the fly. So much like in APEC we can create policies, I can do the same thing here. So now I've tied this EPG to a bridge domain called BD1. Because I'm not going to use multiple EPGs, I'm really stretching a single EPG for my use case, and I'll have the endpoints on both sites communicate. I'm not going to need contracts, but I could configure contracts if you were doing intra-EPG or inter-EPG communication. I haven't defined a VRF yet, so we're going to go ahead and do so now. I'm just going to call it VRF1. And the BD, and notice here I've got a red box around my bridge domain, and that's because it's currently not associated to the VRF. So chicken and the egg, you can create policies, you're just going to have to go back and link them up after you do so. Now the very important things I have to do for this bridge domain is I need it to be layer 2 stretched, and I need to have intersite broadcast unicast multicast traffic allow. And that's going to allow that those policies to go right across for the EPG. So if I flood traffic from the site 3, it'll go across to site 6 and vice versa. Now I also can define my subnets here, so I'm going to do that as well. And I'm going to give myself a subnet here, 1.1.1.254, and the /24, and that happens to be the subnet that my endpoints are currently using. And we'll go ahead and click Save. Okay, I don't need any filters because I'm not using contracts, so that's pretty much it. I'm going to go ahead and save that. The next thing I'm going to do is actually, it's not been deployed yet, so if I just have a quick peek back over here, I can see nothing's actually been pushed yet. I'm just saving my work as I'm going here. Next thing I'll have to do is attach this template to the site. So which sites do I want to have this pushed to? Well, I'm going to want to attach it to both site 3 and site 6. Now, we're going to max out our sites per templates per site at 5 currently, the first version, but we will extend that to more. So depending on how you want to lay it out, usually 1 to 3 templates is pretty good to accomplish most scenarios and use cases. So I'm going to go ahead and save here. So once I attach it to the sites, it kind of gives me some localized configuration under each of the sites. So for example, even though I stretched my EPG to both sites, I'm going to have to do things like static path bindings and domain bindings to each respective site. It's going to be done differently. On site 3, I'm using a VM, and on site 6, I'm using a bare metal physical domain, which goes to my N3K interface. So we have to do some things differently. So the kind of universal or the global configuration happens under the template level. Then once I link the sites, I can actually come in here and I can do additional configuration. So if I go and look at my fabrics here, I've already got this VMware domain called fab3vds configured, and it's already pushed to vCenter with a host attached, and that's already been done here. So I can see I've got my fab3vds. I've got no port groups currently associated though, so I haven't pushed anything from the apex downward there. If I go over now back to my MSC, I want to add that domain binding. So if I come down to the web EPG, once I select it below the sites, I get kind of the site-specific configuration that I may want to add. And the one thing I need to add here is the domain binding. So if I go click on domain over here, I can select the domain type, which is going to be a VMM domain. And it gives me all the other settings I would find at the APIC level, the deployment immediacy, etc. So I'm going to select my domain profile, fab3vds. I'll use on demand for the deployment immediacy, and resolution, I'll keep it on demand as well. And everything else will pretty much stay the same. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Save. Now I haven't pushed any of my configs yet. The only other thing I'm going to have to do now is on the other side, I'll need to do some config there as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Now I will show you what I'm referring to. I will bring over my topology. So we just did this part here, which was configure the VDS domain for my Fabric 3, and then for Fabric 6, my endpoint is actually hanging off of a Nexus 3K switch. I've just put it in there just to give it an IP, just so I can simulate it being a host. And that's going off of Leaf 2 on port 125. So we're going to have to do that config here as well. So if I bop down here now to Fab 6, go to the web EPG, already highlighted. I'm going to have to link the domain and then do the static path binding. So let's start with the domain first. So down under here under domains, I'm going to add a domain. Pick the type. Well, it's going to be a physical domain because I'm really using my switch as an end host, so it'll be a physical domain. And there's the domain I've already created. So that physical domain, just like the VM domain on Fabric 3, I've pre-created it. I've done my access policies, interface selectors. That's all been taken care of already, but it's allowing me to now use those domains as part of my MSC config. Same thing, I'll go ahead and use my my 2 resolution and deployment immediacy. Go ahead and set those. So I've linked that domain. Next thing I'll have to do is set up the static path. So I'm going to use a static port, and the path type is just going to be a regular port. I'm not using a VPC or a port channel. Leaf number I'm going to use will be leaf number 2, and my path will be going to port number 125. So it's reading all these ports that are available from the APIC into MSC and allows me to select them. Now the VLAN I'm using in that VLAN pool that's associated with my N3K domain is just VLAN 50. So I'm going to go ahead and keep that uncap, and deployment immediacy, we'll go ahead and keep this one immediate. And the mode I want to use is untagged. I'm not doing any tagging at the host level, and I really want to just read in all the traffic that comes in into the untagged and go into my VLAN of 50. If you do want to do tagging on your host, no problem. You can either use trunk mode. I'm just really using this as an end host, so I'm just going to keep it as an access port and save. Okay, so I've got my two bindings. So now let's go ahead and click save our work, and we can go ahead and deploy to sites. So it's telling me that we have to deploy this to all these sites. So we're going to go ahead and click on deploy. If there's any problems, it will come back and tell me. Okay, so I got check marks across the board. That's great. Let's go have a look. So over to my tenant on Fabric 3, I should now see my application profile should exist. Great. And my application EPG should exist. There it is. And below that, I should have a domain linked to the VMM domain, and there it is. Great. Also, I'll see under networking, I'll see the VRF, and I should see my BD as well. Perfect. Let's just double check on Fabric 6, make sure that looks good as well. And down underneath, same thing. I'll expand the tenant. Just waiting for this to catch up. Application profile, app 1, application EPG, there's the web EPG. So I should see the domain listed there, so my physical domain should be listed here. And the static port binding should be there as well. So there's that pod 102, 125, and that'll be using VLAN 50, which is what I assigned here. Now just to show you the reason I'm using VLAN 50 is because that's a VLAN I'm using for my VLAN pool assigned to the domain. So we'll just kind of highlight that just so it all makes sense. Under my access policies, I've got my physical domain here, which was already created, called N3KFIS. And in here, I'm pointing to the VLAN pool called N3K VLANs. So if I want to blow that up, I can have a quick look. It's really just a single VLAN range, so nothing much to it, just because I only have the one host as my test. So that's why I'm using VLAN ID of 50 on the static path binding. It has to exist inside of the domain that's bound to that EPG, otherwise we'll get faults. So your AEP, which is what binds your domain to the interfaces, and that's where we've already got that kind of pre-configured. I did that ahead of time so I wouldn't have to waste time with this trivial configuration. Alright, so we've got that all done. Next thing we can do is let's see if our VM we can attach it to that profile. So I've gone back over here into vCenter where I've published that EPG as a port group. I can see here there's my tenant, global tenant, app1, web EPG, and I currently have no interfaces. So I'm going to go ahead and take my web host here, and I'm going to go ahead and attach it to the global tenant EPG. Now this particular host, I'm going to open him up. I got to make a quick change to his IP address. He's currently configured for 2.2 address, so I'm going to whip him over really quick. So just bear with me while I do that. We'll do interface 6. No. Yes. No. Okay, so we're just going to make him 1.1.1. Quite simple. Net mask can stay the same. And everyone needs a gateway, so we'll give him a gateway. And his gateway really should just be 1.1.1.254. Okay. Alright, so that's all done. We'll go log back into the host now. So just looking at if config eth0, and I can see there's my address 1.1.1. So if I go and ping his gateway, there we go. Now the reason that's working is because we already have the gateway we've defined. We pushed it from MSC. So if I want to look at that gateway that was pushed, if I go back over to that particular bridge domain, so inside of here I'll have a subnet which I pushed as part of the config. So I've got the bridge domain already in existence. So once it comes down here, I will have a bridge domain and my subnet has already been defined. Now if I take this off, and I can very well do so, if I happen to delete it, I'll I'll see that that will no longer work. So now if I go back to my VM, that's not going to work. Well, what happens if I accidentally delete configuration? Well, nice and simple, I can re-push it from MSC. So I can come back to here and go deploy to sites, and it'll make sure that nothing got overwritten. Go back here, bingo, there's my gateway which got pushed back, and now I will be able to reping my gateway again. Great. Okay, we know we got one side. Now the question is, can I ping to my other host? Okay. Okay, so the interface that I'm using is just E1/10. So I can see here I've got him assigned to the same subnet. I've got him attached to a VRF I've just called Fab6 on this particular host, on this switch. So what I'm going to try and do now is the same thing. I'm going to try and ping from this 3K in site 6 across over to my host, which is in Fab3 on the other site. So if I go ping 1.1.1.1 VRF Fab6. Okay, so we ARP, the next pings go through as expected. And the same thing here as well, I should be able to ping back. And we can hit them. So it shows our policy worked. We didn't have to put any contracts. Now some verification you can do if I wanted to make sure that, if it wasn't working, the first thing I'd probably do is go to the respective EPGs and make sure your endpoint's being learned in the EPG. So here's my test host here, my test web VM. I got the MAC address, the IP address as I expect. Now because it's a VM, my learning source should be both VMM and learned. Learned means you see it on the wire. I actually learned it from seeing traffic. VMM tells me that I've learned about this VM endpoint from vCenter. It tells me the server and the interfaces it's currently using. And then there's my dynamic VLAN endcap that's used from the VM domain pool. Now if I look at my other side, if I go back to the tenant view, I'll do the same thing. I'll look on this side, I'll take a look at the EPG, drill down in here, and all the way down to the web EPG. And same thing, I'll go ahead and look at the operational view and look at the client endpoints. And here I can see there's my MAC address I'm learning from the Nexus 3K. There's the IP address, and we are alerting the traffic because we see it on the wire. And it shows me that I'm learning this through this particular interface. My endcap is obviously VLAN 50, which is the native VLAN for that interface. So we've demonstrated that we can very simply configure almost all the policies right from MSC here. So very simple, a single schema sets us up for a very simple deployment. If I want to have a look, I can always look at the health from our dashboard. So from our dashboard view, I can see if there's any problems or perhaps a policy failed or there was an issue. From this view right in here, I can see that the schema shows me that that particular template is good to go on both of my fabrics. So it gives you a good, nice snapshot of the current health. Other than that, as a quick recap, we did a whole bunch of things here today. So we deployed a stretched fabric across our sites, which worked quite well. We configured the IPN. So we brought up our fabrics here. We attached both of our sites to the MSC after we did the installation. Very simple. Configured our IPN, a very simple process, but if you haven't done it, hopefully seeing what I did there does make it a little bit easier when you attempt to do it. Define all the TEP addresses, and again, I highly recommend we do so. These TEPs are very important. Just to kind of cover what they do, so my multicast TEP would be used if I have to communicate with multi-sites. So almost think of it as like an Anycast for all your sites. The unicast is if I have to hit endpoints within a specific site or all endpoints within a site. My MPod is going to be specific to a pod, which right now is kind of irrelevant since we only support the one pod. That's the only one we're ever going to have. But as we expand support to include multiple pods, you'll have more of these MPod DTEPs assigned. And then at the lowest, we've got our control plane TEP for each of our spines. And because I only have a single spine in my topology, we only need that single CP TEP per site. So lay these all out, keep a good network diagram. That way if there are any problems, we can very easily refer back to this and say, okay, yes, we're learning our tunnels on the correct interfaces, everything's looking good. Gives us a really a good roadmap to look at your environment. So hopefully you enjoyed the video. I thank you very much for watching.